Panel, bine ați venit la acest panel. I will speak in English. O să vorbesc în engleză, dar pentru cei care nu cunosc foarte bine limba engleză, interpretarea simultană este asigurată. So interpretation is provided in Romanian and in English. The title of our panel is From the Prague NATO Summit to the Madrid NATO Summit, NATO after 20 years, new challenges and new opportunities. I will be extremely brief in my short introduction because we have time restraints. So I will say just one thing about Prague NATO. It was one of the extremely important summit for my country and for other 6 countries. So the total of 7 countries were invited to join NATO. Absolutely essential decision concerning the, let's say, the current situation concerning the future for the whole region. Of course, a lot has happened in these 20 years. The situation is completely different now from many points of view compared with 20 years ago. I look at some of these decisions taken in Prague NATO summit. There were discussions about, let's say, having Russia together in the fight against terrorism. Now, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the situation is a completely different story. And we have here a very impressive list of speakers who will have to deal with some of the issues related to this panel. Issues like the Madrid summit clearly stated which are the risks, threats and challenges facing the North Atlantic Alliance. Is that enough? What steps should be taken in order to see concrete actions and further political unity among allies? Another issue is developing a new perspective on relation with the Russian Federation. And in the current context, NATO has the opportunity to enhance its partnership around the world and encourage further integration. How will its policies for the Black Sea region look like following the Madrid summit? I said that we have a very impressive list of speakers. My first speaker on the list is His Excellency Mr. Bogdan AURESCU, Minister of Foreign Affairs. I will present him very briefly because he is very well known, not only in Romania. He is currently at the 4th mandate as Minister of Foreign Affairs. The first one was in between 2014-2015. He was also presidential advisor on foreign affairs. We were colleagues during that period. His list of achievements is really very, very impressive. He was the chief negotiator of the Romania United States Ballistic Missile Defense Agreement and of the joint declaration of the strategic partnership for the 21st century between Romania and the United States. He was the Romanian's agent at the International Court of Justice, coordinating the team that represented Romania in the case of maritime delimitation of the Black Sea. He's an acknowledged university professor, an international law expert. He's a member of United Nations International Law Commission, member of the Permanent Court of Arbitrage in The Hague, substitute member of the Venice Commission. Your Excellency, Mr. Minister, you have the floor.
Dear Leonard, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really honored to be here today for this conference, and I'm really honored to be part of such a distinguished panel. Thank you so much for your presence here today in Bucharest. And I would like to express my deep appreciation for the host, for the New Strategy Center, for organizing this event. The New Strategy Center, everybody knows, it's a well-established think tank and has demonstrated over the years, everybody knows that, its added value in promoting a broader and deeper understanding of the most relevant topics of the international agenda. And again, I'm really honored that the Foreign Ministry of Romania is a partner in organizing this event. It is a distinct pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share with you some views regarding such a relevant and important topic, from the Prague summit to the NATO summit in Madrid. So NATO after 20 years. This is a very complex topic with a lot of implications, taking into account the profound changes in the security environment that we have been facing, and the continuous adaptation of NATO to these changes. It is also a topic of great relevance for my country. As Leonard mentioned, the Prague summit invited Romania to start the process of becoming a member of the alliance. And I think indeed in the last 2 decades, this process of transformation of Romania, before and after becoming a member of NATO, marked our own success story within the alliance. And I'm not shy in saying that. I think the profile of Romania within NATO is a well-established and recognized profile. Let me first start by underlining the complex nature of the security environment that we are facing, and the radical transformation that took place in the last 2 decades, but especially in the last year and mainly in the last 6 months. 20 years ago, the world was still in shock after the dark spectrum of terrorism has struck. And as you know, the 9/11 attacks brought in focus the rising danger of terror over our countries, our territories, and our people. It was for the first time when Article 5 of the Washington Treaty was invoked. And as you mentioned, Leonard, at that time Russia was still considered a partner of the alliance in the fight against terrorism. And we also have just embarked at that time in having a formalized framework of cooperation, which was the NATO-Russia Council, which was launched in May 2002. Over the years, unfortunately, our security environment became more and more complex and threatening. And we have been witnessing over the years increased dynamics in the evolution and nature of the challenges, especially in our vicinity, both from the east and from the south. The conventional nature of threat has no longer been the norm, with the rise of asymmetric and hybrid threats, resulting in a mix of dangerous instruments used by state and non-state actors. In the last years, this dark picture got even darker. In what should be rightly considered as a long-term strategy, Russia spared no effort in order to reinstate by any means, even by brutal force, its own full-fledged great power status. And acting in a logic of spheres of influence and in no respect for international law and for its norms and principles, Moscow increased its assertiveness, its destructive rhetoric, its hybrid threats in order to change borders, to reconfigure the security architecture according to its own interests. The 2008 war against Georgia and then the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 has been a clear evidence of this confrontational behavior. Unfortunately, this year we have witnessed a dramatic negative evolution of this trend. On the 24th of February, Russia decided to attack a peaceful and independent state, bringing for the first time in many years the war back in Europe. And this attack was not just an attack against Ukraine. It was not just an attack against regional security. It was not just an attack against the European security. It was an attack against the Euro-Atlantic security and an attempt to change the core parameters of the international security architecture, with global implications as well. Today, Russia is undoubtedly the most serious and direct threat to the Euro-Atlantic security, and given the current evolutions, unfortunately, it will remain so on the long term. These profound changes in the security environment were also reflected in the transformation of NATO, which over the years knew some historic landmarks. I witnessed personally this transformation since 2009, when I started to be responsible as Deputy Minister in the Foreign Ministry for Security Affairs, including for the preparation of all NATO summits which have been organized since then. And over the years, we have contributed a lot to this transformation. One such moment was definitely the Prague summit in 2002, when the alliance embarked on a full-scale transformation of NATO for the 21st century. On that occasion, the ambition of the allies, as it was included in the documents of the summit, were to prepare NATO to be able to cope with the current and future challenges, including the threat of terrorism, but also the spread of weapons of mass destruction. But this transformation process continued over the years, in line with the evolution of the threat, as I already mentioned, ensuring that NATO remains the most successful political military alliance in history. And I do believe that this is the case also today. The summit in 2014, the POWELL summit, the summit in 2016, the Warsaw summit, showed that the alliance clearly understood the nature and importance of today's security, and the decisions taken on those occasions demonstrated the will of all allies to act united to efficiently address these challenges. I remember the POWELL summit very well, when we decided to introduce the pledge for 2% allocated to defense and for acquisitions of modern equipment in order to allow our countries to become efficient in countering the threat. I remember the very important decision of Wales to start creating the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, and then the Warsaw Summit with the crucial decisions to create the forward presence on the eastern flank. At that time, an enhanced forward presence in the northern part of the eastern flank, and then a tailored forward presence in the south of the eastern flank. This year marked another essential and historic hallmark for the alliance. The NATO summit in Madrid has been a crucial milestone, achieving a new threshold and strongly anchoring the alliance in the current security landscape. It has it has set a comprehensive cooperation agenda with concrete objectives for the post-2022 security environment. And the deliverables of the Madrid summit are indeed consolidating NATO's long-term deterrence and defense posture on the eastern flank, with a shift of posture from forward presence to forward defense. And this is for the first time mentioned in the summit declaration of Madrid. And this is due to our efforts, the efforts of other allies on the eastern flank. And we have been coordinating all this effort within the Bucharest 9 format, which was created at the initiative of the President of Romania, Mr. Klaus Iohannis, and the President of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda, back in 2015. Of course, the decisions of the Madrid summit regarding the posture on the eastern flank were based on the decisions of the March summit in Brussels, where another important decision was taken, which is the decision to create 4 new battle groups on the eastern flank, thus balancing the presence of NATO on the eastern flank. This was an objective that Romania has been pushing for quite a long time, to have a balanced approach of the whole eastern flank, to see eastern flank as a unit, as a single unit. And this was achieved in March, and then the Madrid summit has built on this achievement. Also, through the new strategic concept of NATO, countries shaped a long-term vision, putting again collective defense and Article 5 at the core of their actions, and implementing a significant transformation of our deterrence and defense posture. We have seen the consolidation of NATO's posture on the whole of the eastern flank. Romania has been advocating, as I mentioned, for quite some time for this balanced approach, especially that the southern part of the eastern flank, where Romania is located at the Black Sea, is the, well, closest to the hotspot in Ukraine. As I was mentioning at the beginning, from Prague to Madrid, this journey is extremely relevant for Romania. In Prague, we have received the historic invitation to join the alliance. Since then, we have embarked on a path that required a lot of efforts and dedication. Today, we are full-fledged members of NATO, a responsible and active ally, and we are working to consolidate the profile of our country in the alliance. And for Romania, NATO continues to be the cornerstone of the Euro-Atlantic security. It is through NATO that our security has reached an unprecedented level. And this is, well, very valid today, even if we see what happens next to us in Ukraine. The adaptation process started in Wales, continued in Warsaw, has been instrumental, as I mentioned. The Madrid summit went even further. We are now hosting NATO structures on our ground. We have a substantial military presence of the allies on our territory. We are an integral part of a consolidating posture that unites the north and the south of the eastern flank. And what is extremely important, we have managed to include in the documents of the summit the fact that the Black Sea is a region of strategic importance for the Euro-Atlantic security. And we have to build on that. All of these are strategic gains for our country that reconfirm once again the validity of our unwavering Euro-Atlantic path. At a time when there is a tendency to claim the disintegration of liberal values, we chose to remain faithful to our common democratic values, to multilateral instruments, and to international law and like-minded partnerships. In this sense, Romania takes its commitments with utmost seriousness. We are very much aware of the fact that security and defense starts at home. That is why we have decided to increase the defense spending from 2% to 2.5% starting with next year. And we count on allied solidarity, but also we fully contribute to that. At this critical moment for our security, we need to continue to strengthen NATO as a foundation of our collective defense and as an essential forum for transatlantic security consultations and decisions among allies. It is important to continue promoting an approach based on unity and solidarity and on the strength of the transatlantic link. And the transatlantic link is more powerful than ever before. And this is one of the results of the war Russia unleashed against Ukraine. I think President Putin has miscalculated a lot his plans. He thought that he would attack Ukraine and occupy Ukraine in a couple of days. But this was not the case. To the contrary, Ukraine is resisting with the help of the international democratic community. And now it's even counterattacking, which is very important. And Putin's soldiers have abandoned their parade uniforms, which were carrying at the beginning of the war. Mr. Putin tried to divide us and tried to attack our unity. To the contrary, the unity inside NATO is more powerful than ever. The unity inside the EU is more powerful than ever. The unity between the two shores of the Atlantic is more powerful than ever. Well, he thought that he would intimidate the countries in the region, including in the alliance and in the European Union. The effect was to the contrary. Neutral countries like Finland and Sweden decided to join the alliance. Other countries in our eastern neighborhood decided to embark more decisively on the European path, and the European Council in June decided to grant candidate status to Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova and to recognize the European perspective of Georgia. So, I think we should thank Mr. Putin for that. Well, we need to continue to invest. We need to continue to invest in our solidarity. We need to continue to invest in the transatlantic link. We need to continue to invest in our capacities, and we need to continue to invest in our partnerships. All of them are key to NATO's role and NATO's credibility. We experience a challenging landscape, but it also presents NATO with a real opportunity, which we have already started to use. And this will give us greater relevance on the international stage. As the security situation stands right now, we see no other option than continuing NATO's effort to consolidate further the deterrence and defense posture on the eastern flank, including in the Black Sea region, and to continue to actively support our partners. And indeed, our partners in the Black Sea region, our partners in the Balkans region are very important for us. Because we have, and NATO has, and the EU has, to continue to support the consolidation of their resilience. Consolidating their resilience means more security for us. And this is valid for Ukraine, of course, for Georgia, for the Republic of Moldova, which need our continuous attention and support. And we can show that our partners are not alone. And this is because we are in an era where security is increasingly fluid, and together includes us all. And I would mention here the role of the Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience that we have created in Romania, in Bucharest, which is already becoming operational, and which already grants support in building resilience for our partners in the East. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by reaffirming Romania's resolve to actively contribute to all efforts aimed at consolidating the international security architecture in order to achieve a safer and more secure world. And I think a key role will have in this respect the NATO meeting of the foreign ministers that I will host at the end of November here in Bucharest, and which no doubtedly will take care of the issues related to the implementation of the decisions taken by the NATO summit. This is another recognition, the fact that we are hosting this event, another recognition of Romania's role within the alliance. I would be happy to take your questions and join in what I expect to be a challenging but most rewarding debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your very comprehensive speech. I will now, invite the following speaker to take the floor. I'm talking about Dr. Andrei Benedescic. I don't know if my pronunciation was the correct one, but okay. He's State Secretary for National International Security in the office, within the office of the Prime Minister in Slovenia. Our guest is a real expert in security issues. He served as an alternate representative in the United Nations Security Council. He was ambassador in Moscow. He was also a permanent representative on the North Atlantic Council in Brussels. He also was the permanent representative of Slovenia to the United Nations, the OSCE, and other international organizations in Vienna. He chaired the General Working Group of the Wassenaar Arrangement on Exports Control for Conventional Arms and Dual-Use Goods and Technologies, the Open Sky Consultative Commissions, and the OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation. He was also governor of the Republic of Slovenia in the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Agency's special envoy of the Foreign Minister for the Control of Conventional Arms, Chemical and Biological Disarmament and Nuclear Proliferation, and so on and so on. So you have the floor, please. And thank you for your presence here in Bucharest.
Well, thank you for this really kind presentation, and at the same time also I would like to thank the New Strategy Center for having me here. Thank you for allowing me to be again in Bucharest. It is a great pleasure for me to be in this beautiful city, and actually especially today for two reasons. The first one is that I'm able to say thank you directly to the Foreign Minister of Romania. thank you for Minister AURESCU for helping us out in July. In July, Slovenia was faced with wildfires of enormous extent, and the contribution from your side of 2 Spartan planes with special capability for fighting fires was extremely important to us. As they say, a friend in need is a friend indeed, and once again you have shown that you are a true friend and a true ally. Let me just say that one of the reasons why the wildfires were so dangerous is that they took place in the karst region of Slovenia, which during World War I was part of the so-called Zonca front, and that is also why the firefighters had an extremely hard time, not only because of the terrain, because of the rocky features, but also because they were faced with numerous unexploded ordnances from World War I, and basically were not able to go into the fire, which is why help from the air was extremely important. So once again, thank you, Romania. Let me also say that, of course, this particular example also shows how things have changed, and this brings me to my second point. I really am glad to be able to speak on this topic, because when it comes, for example, to the Madrid summit, the declaration, but also the strategic concept which was adopted, it also recognized climate change as one of the issues that we need to be attentive to when it comes to security in the future. And let me also say that some of our procurement decisions in the future will also reflect this particular experience of ours. So we are already looking into our Spartan plane, which is supposed to arrive next year, to also have an additional module for firefighting, for to act like a Canadair, to be basically a kind of a double use capability. As the minister mentioned, before 2002, the Prague summit was basically, in a way, another age. The declaration was very much marked by what happened earlier that year in Rome, when the Rome Declaration was adopted and when the NATO-Russia Council was established. It seemed that we were in a totally new environment, an environment where NATO would go expeditionary. As you remember, this was already several months after the creation of the ISAF operation, and of course 1 year after 9/11, which triggered the first ever activation of Article 5. It has been already described that NATO has traveled quite a path since then, and if I return to the question posed by the moderator about what have we learned and where we are going, I would emphasize 3 points as far as the NATO allies are concerned. I think that the first point is that we do now have a clear understanding of Russia, both of its intent, but also of its capabilities. I would also say that there is now an understanding among the allies about the danger of geopolitical gray zones or vacuum in its neighborhood. And finally, I would say that the allies now understand also the absolute need to engage on a global scale and also to engage in that sense with the global partners. When it comes to the first point, the very fact that we are mentioning here the Prague summit shows that the alliance was has basically really traveled a long path in its approach to Russia. Russia was defined in the previous NATO strategic concept as a strategic partner. We really went out of our way to accommodate their desires, their fears, and we gave them also through the NATO-Russia Council a privileged forum for discussion. NATO-Russia Council could not really be compared to the Ukraine NATO Commission or Georgia NATO Commission. As you also know, one of the official languages of the NATO-Russia Council was also Russian, in addition to English and French. So it was really a privileged forum, which we thought that the Russian side would take advantage of. Even after the war with Georgia, we continued with our approach of constructiveness. I also already mentioned the Lisbon decision, but even after the Crimea took place, we were looking for a kind of a ramp off, and we always took into account the spirit and the letter of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. In fact, we are still following it today because, as you know, the limit there informally is of no substantial combat forces in new member states, which was always understood as no more than a brigade per country. And of course, the NATO-Russia Founding Act also includes very important language regarding nuclear capabilities and nuclear infrastructure. However, today it is clear that Russia is on a path of its own, on a path of exclusivism, on a path of some sort of a Eurasianism, and in that sense, I have to say that I was really struck, especially by the speech of President Putin of February the 21st, which precluded the actual invasion, and which really sounded like a historiographic discussion, like an argument on historiography of Eastern Europe and of also history of Ukraine and of Russia itself. One of the problematic issues of that speech is also that it implied the possibility of changes in borders also wider in Europe. Already at the beginning of the speech, President Putin, for example, implied that the western territory of Poland really belongs to Germany, and so on and so forth. So this is a really problematic approach, and I think that it is clear now to us all that we are dealing with a country that understands force, and that, well, you know, the doors for dialogue remain open. That needs to be taken also at its word, and what has been said by President Putin is, as I said, very problematic indeed. At the same time, we have also traveled a long path when it comes to the understanding of the Russian capabilities, the Russian capacities. One of the surprises of the Georgia war was that the Russian side actually managed to achieve what it achieved. You probably are aware, I see many people in uniform here, the assessment of the performance of the Russian military at the time, which was not exactly stellar. And that then launched on the Russian side the military reforms. And our impression from the Crimea operation in 2014 was that these reforms have been spectacularly successful. As we see now from the performance of the Russian military in Ukraine, we basically overestimated the Russian armed forces. And apparently it is true what they say, that armed forces basically reflect the society. And just as the Russian society, unfortunately, is thoroughly corrupt, so apparently the Russian armed forces are also suffering the result of the systemic corruption and the systemic failures that Russia has encountered in more than the past 2 decades. In that sense, of course, we have to adjust our understanding of the actual military threat that Russia represents. You probably remember that only a couple of years ago we were talking about Sputnik II moment when it comes to Russia. We were saying that because of the development of some of the new forms of weaponry, especially when it comes to hypersonic weapons, Russia has basically overtaken the West in certain aspects of technology, and we basically felt on the defensive. I think that this must be reassessed now, while of course also taking into account the fact that Russia remains a nuclear power. And in that sense, I return once again to the issue of the NATO-Russia Founding Act and the language there, which relates to nuclear infrastructure. I think that in the future we have to discuss also how to approach this issue, also from the perspective of the well-known Russian escalate to de-escalate nuclear doctrine. So this is one of the challenges for NATO allies in the future. The other one is acting on our new understanding that living gray zones is dangerous. Let me say that when I joined the North Atlantic Council in 2011, and that was just as the operation in Libya was winding down, that I could really sense fatigue in the alliance when it came to the issue of enlargement, and also fatigue when it came, for example, to the issue of the Western Balkans. I remember the phrase that we spend too much time per capita per Western Balkans. As we know now, this was not the wisest approach, and I'm therefore glad that when it comes to Euro-Atlantic institutions, it is actually NATO that took the lead in taking the necessary steps, especially when it comes to the admission of Montenegro and afterwards also of North Macedonia into the Euro-Atlantic structures. I also think that on the basis of what we have seen from the Russian side, and also on the basis of the new assessment of what Russia is and is capable of or is not capable of, we should also return to the important decisions that were taken here in Bucharest in 2008, where we said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. I think we need to start thinking about acting on that particular promise. And I also think that we need to finish the unfinished business in the Western Balkans. And here I would like to also highlight the fact that, of course, today when we are faced with the Russian threat on a number of fronts, including when it comes to food security and other forms of security, it is important and it does matter how countries in the region approach Russia and their relations with Russia. And in that sense, I would also like to say that I think it is important to have a clear look also at the behavior of some countries in the region, and let me be here quite explicit. Serbia, when it comes to sitting on two chairs with regards to its either European or Euro-Atlantic path and its relations with Russia. And this, of course, also affects NATO, because NATO, as you know, still has its longest running operation in the region. It is called KFOR in Kosovo. And I think that some of the allies should also look again at some of the issues that have been dividing us in the past. I think that some of the statements by Prime Minister of Kosovo, Kurti, in the past weeks and months regarding Kosovo's aspirations should be taken into account and should be looked at also from the perspective of finishing the unfinished business in the region. As far as Slovenia is concerned, let me just say that from the perspective of the EU, we're working really hard that, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina gets a European perspective by the end of this year. And my third point is an increased awareness of the need to engage globally and the importance of partners. This is actually something that NATO had been working on already soon after the Prague summit, also because of the engagement in Afghanistan. I still remember the ambitious atmosphere surrounding the NATO Chicago summit of 2012, when we said that NATO should become the hub of a global security network. And of course, contingent on that ambition was also the idea that it is precisely because of that reason that we need to establish a strategic partnership with Russia so that our back would be covered and that we could then concentrate on a global scale with expeditionary forces that would be capable of fighting in the high north, but also in the tropics, also on the Spratly Islands, as we said. In fact, NATO, and it has to be really acknowledged, had the foresight of already discussing the issue of China in those days. Unfortunately, because of the events that were caused by Russia, because of annexation of Crimea and the restructuring of NATO, some of that attention was then apparently not that much in focus, which is why I'm all the more glad that the new strategic concept actually puts also China right there front and center. And in that sense, of course, the Madrid summit was also important because of our engagement with some of our Indo-Pacific partners, and also important in the sense, of course, of increasing our membership, especially with Finland and Sweden. But one of the interesting effects of the actions by Russia has been also increased EU-NATO cooperation. Here I would also like to be quite frank. One of the things that shocked me the most when I arrived to Brussels in 2011 was some sort of underlying animosity on one part of the city towards the other part of the city, especially on the EU side towards the NATO side. I have to say I was really surprised. There was also some sort of underlining, even I could call it Amerophobia. And in that sense, the events that followed in 2014 very much corrected this, I would call, aberration. I also attach great importance to the fact that the decisions that were taken at the in Warsaw and in Brussels 2016 and 2018 have paved the way for increased EU-NATO cooperation, which is all the more important in the future. And the future, as you know, is quite unpredictable. Since the Prague summit, the area of operation of NATO has increased from 3 to 5. We have also included cyber and space. So this just gives you the idea of how much the world has changed. And in that sense, of course, we need not only global partners, but also increased cooperation in the Western world, in the Euro-Atlantic world, which is, as you know, connected by same values and by same ideas of freedom. I think that also in the future we should not forget about other organizations. And here I would like to mention an organization that sometimes does not really get a lot of, shall we say, positive reviews, the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Let me say that the OSCE, which was really born out of the Cold War, has nonetheless shown to be an all-weather forum. If NATO-Russia Council is a fair weather forum, then the Permanent Council of the OSCE is an all-weather forum. It still is convened, even though the discussions are not necessarily always productive. But even more importantly, we're still talking, when it comes to the OSCE, about the three pillars of the European security architecture, namely the Vienna document, the CFE Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty. And here I would like to say that regardless of the current situation that we find ourselves in, these instruments have proven their worth. If you had followed the discussions, for example, on the Vienna document over the past years in Vienna, you could have sensed that something was coming. And at the same time, if you were following the discussions within the Open Skies Consultative Commission, you could see actually the storm coming. I chaired the commission in 2017. It was an extremely difficult period. I had to learn the Open Skies Treaty by heart. It's a very interesting one, especially the technical part. There was a big problem with the distribution of quotas because of Russia. And as you know, the final warning and the really red sign was the Russia leaving the Open Skies Treaty last December. And that is also why, just before the Russian invasion, we were not able to verify independently through the Open Skies system the accumulation of Russian forces on Ukrainian border. So when you're thinking about the future, I think we need to take into account also positive experience with these parts of the European security architecture so that we amplify them and also improve them when starting to construct perhaps a new European security architecture for the future. In conclusion, I would just like to say that I think that it goes beyond doubt that NATO has proven itself in the past 2 decades as a flexible, responsive organization, and as an organization that is really was really trailblazer when it comes to the issue of European security, especially also in the Western Balkans. Which is why I have to be quite frank with you. When European Union received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, I felt that maybe perhaps it would be even more appropriate if NATO had received it, because also NATO, as an organization, as an alliance, made possible the big success that is the European Union and the European cooperation. And this just leads me, and I'll conclude with that, to the issue of strategic autonomy. Sometimes, as you know, this phrase can be misunderstood. In the past, that is why in the past many people also on the EU side have gone to lengths to explain that strategic autonomy does not affect Euro-Atlantic link and Euro-Atlantic cooperation. And I'm always glad when I hear that. And nonetheless, I have to say that when the strategic concept, the new strategic concept of NATO was being prepared, and we had discussions also with some of the experts from the Eminent Persons Group, I was struck by one of the questions that we received, the Slovenian side, to the fact of, do we agree with the possibility of also having EU coordination at NATO? I have to say, as a former permanent representative to NATO, that my breath was taken away by the suggestion, by the suggestion in the sense of its provocativeness and possible destructiveness for NATO efficiency, if you know how NATO operates, for the practices of NATO, for the very spirit of the alliance and the way that allies operate. In that sense, my appeal would be to work for increased EU-NATO cooperation, but then at the same time respecting NATO practices and NATO traditions. Because at the end of the day, what is NATO? NATO is an organization that has perfected the most the way for sovereign countries to operate in the area which is the most sensitive for sovereign countries, and that is the area of defense. So let's keep it that way. Thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Benedicic, for your very interesting speech. I will invite now the following speakers: Mr. Charles Power, Director of the Elcano Royal Institute from Spain. This Elcano Royal Institute is a Spain leading international relations think tank, and Mr. Charles Power is also a professor of contemporary history at CEU San Pablo University. Prior to settling in Spain, he was lecturer in history at Corpus Christi College in Oxford, and he published a significant number of books and articles on Spanish history, politics, and foreign policy, with special emphasis on its European dimension. He is a very well-known expert on EU affairs. He was also appointed a companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George for his services to British-Spanish relations. Mr. Powell, please.
Thank you very much. I will speak seated, if that's all right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, it's a great honor and a pleasure to have been asked to address this forum. And it's wonderful to be back in Bucharest, which has become one of my favorite European capitals in the last few years. As you can see, I don't have a terribly Spanish-sounding name, but I am in fact a Spanish national, and I am extremely proud and honored to be the director of the Real Instituto Elcano, which is Spain's leading think tank. I was also very pleased that Elcano was one of the 4 institutions that co-hosted the Madrid NATO Public Forum back in June, together with the Munich Security Conference, Atlantic Council, and the German Marshall Fund. So the Madrid Summit and the Madrid Strategic Concept will be, I think, part of my personal history now forever. It's interesting looking back how much these last 6 months have changed our lives, have changed Europe, and have changed the world at large. Back in late 2021, when we were preparing the program for the NATO Public Forum, to be honest with you, I was rather concerned that it would be a rather dull affair. There didn't seem to be any terribly interesting issues that we could discuss that would captivate a generalist audience. The sexiest item on the agenda was the climate security nexus, to be totally frank with you. And yet, as a result of the brutal, illegal, and totally unwarranted invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, everything changed. It also changed, interestingly, Spanish perceptions of threat. We at Elcano conducted a poll in June, according to which, first of all, 54% of Spaniards spontaneously identified Russia as the major threat to Spanish national security, and I cannot emphasize to you what a sea change in political culture this represents for my country. And secondly, 82% of those polled said that they supported Spanish membership of NATO. Again, totally unparalleled. So thank you, Mr. Putin, once again. Now, as a historian, we historians tend to break down history into convenient periods, because this basically gives us a false sense of security. And a great deal has already been said about the last 20 years. But I suppose very briefly, and to summarize, one could say that in the 1990s, NATO dealt with the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in particular, of course, the implosion of the former Yugoslavia, with NATO's interventions in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1995, and then Serbia during the Kosovo War in 1999. One could then say that the next decade was largely spent dealing with the consequences of 9/11 and NATO's commitment to Afghanistan, of course, was really what defined the alliance's objectives during that period. And by the way, I think we mentioned this at last year's forum here in Bucharest. Perhaps we, despite the Ukraine war with its sense of urgency, we need to go back to the lessons learned, I think, about NATO's long involvement in Afghanistan. And finally, the last decade, as we've already seen from previous speakers' interventions, has been dominated by the consequences of Russian revisionism. And it is very interesting and I think important to remind ourselves how deceived we were, how easily deceived we were when Mr. Putin was elected in the year 2000. Initially, a lot of Western leaders, including our former Prime Minister, José María Aznar, believed that Putin was someone one could do business with. Things, of course, began to go wrong, partly as a result of successive enlargements to Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm fascinated by the Bucharest summit. And since we are in Bucharest, let me just explain why. I think the jury is still out, of course, on who is really responsible for this, but I think we made a massive mistake, a very serious mistake in the Bucharest summit, in the sense that we agreed that Ukraine and Georgia would become members, but by not giving those countries a membership action plan, we ultimately managed to alarm the Russians without giving Ukraine and Georgia the kind of guarantees that they really needed. I think this is something that, again, we should keep in mind as we go forward. I think we should also be honest in recognizing that NATO's response to Georgia in 2008 was very weak, and that this probably generated a sense of impunity in Russia. Be that as it may, I think the turning point, obviously, is the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which marked a complete turning point, and the Wales summit that has already been mentioned in September of that year. And it's really the Wales summit that marks the beginning of a process of adaptation and rebalancing towards collective defense and deterrence, and away from the crisis management and out-of-area focus that had dominated NATO until then. The goal of the Wales summit was basically to reassure our Central and East European allies in face of this growing Russian revisionism, hence the launch of the Readiness Action Plan, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, and so on, which have already been mentioned. And then finally, of course, we have the Warsaw Summit in 2016, which accelerated this process. Now, the Madrid summit has been fascinating to watch because obviously the war in Ukraine was a game changer. And NATO, I think, has stepped up to the plate and has lived up to its expectations. The Madrid Strategic Concept is a very powerful document, and the elements that compose this concept are well known, and I won't go over them. But I did want to mention something that was briefly touched upon, which is China. We have finally taken a position on China, and what I'd like to stress here is that we are also implicitly acknowledging that there is a very strong relationship, there is a very clear linkage between the Eastern European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. This is more implicit than it is explicit in the Madrid strategic concept, and this raises very interesting questions about the future division of labor between the United States and Europe in these two different theaters. But I think it's very important to raise this. For Spain, of course, winning the war in Ukraine should be our top priority. But as you know, in Spain, there has always been concern that the Ukraine war would lead NATO to turn its back on the southern flank. To some extent, I think that fear, that danger was averted in the Madrid summit, which is obviously good news, since the Middle East and North Africa region will continue to be unstable and unpredictable in years to come. But, and I have been critical of the Spanish government in the past in this regard, I think the Spanish government and other Southern European governments need to be more specific as to what they believe NATO should and can do in that region, probably very often in close collaboration with the European Union. Our previous speaker raised a very interesting question, which I will raise now, because perhaps we won't have time later on, regarding the impact of the war on strategic autonomy, the European Union's strategic autonomy. Now, to paraphrase the wonderful Mark Twain, I think news of its death has been greatly exaggerated. Admittedly, the war has increased Europe's strategic dependence on the United States. In a sense, you could even argue that the war in Ukraine has strengthened NATO at the expense of the European Union. And I realize that the concept itself, strategic autonomy, I don't particularly like the word autonomy, I prefer strategic responsibility, was already highly contested in countries such as Romania and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. Many people have, I think, mistakenly seen this as a French inspired project which could only weaken NATO and the transatlantic relationship. Inevitably, the war has exacerbated some of these feelings, some of these fears, and some people have gone so far as to claim that Finland and Sweden's application for NATO membership proves that the EU falls far short of its aspirations. I think this criticism is largely unfair, and I'm convinced that some form of strategic autonomy will continue to be on the EU's agenda in years to come. And I will very quickly mention some of the reasons why I believe this to be the case. First of all, paradoxically perhaps, the war has made it painfully clear that we in Europe cannot fend for ourselves without the United States, and it is therefore increasingly clear that we have not been taking our defense and security commitments seriously enough. Germany's U-turn is encouraging, but of course, spending vast amounts of money does not automatically guarantee a real change. Political will and social support for the use of these new military capacities will also be required. The second reason is that the United States, as we all know, will increasingly focus its attention on the Indo-Pacific theater and will therefore expect the European Union to act in its neighborhood in non-Article 5 scenarios. Thirdly, there is, I think, a justified fear that the occupant of the White House after the 2024 presidential elections may not be terribly well disposed towards the alliance, in which case we have reason to be concerned. And finally, I think it's also an important point, the European Union is actually better suited because of its toolkit, because of its policies and instruments to prepare European member states to improve their commitments in the defense and security field. NATO is an intergovernmental organization. The European Union has supranational instruments, funds, tools such as the European Defence Fund, the European Defence Agency, which can actually allow Europe to spend more, but above all, to spend much better and to spend together. So for all of these reasons, I think European strategic autonomy, however you want to phrase it or interpret it, will continue to be on the EU's agenda despite the war in Ukraine. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. I would like to tell you that I fully share what you said about the EU strategic autonomy. This will not disappear on the EU agenda, on the contrary. And this will, this is my firm belief, that this will also help for the strengthening of NATO. Okay, but there are different views about this aspect. The last speaker on our list is Mr. Bruno TERTRAIS, Deputy Director, Fondation pour la Recherche Strategique, France. His expertise is international relations and geopolitics, conflicts, United States strategy, transatlantic relations, security in the Middle East, security in Asia, nuclear proliferation, military strategy, and so on and so on. He was senior research fellow in the Foundation for Strategic Research. He was also member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, member of the editorial board, the Washington Quarterly, member of the editorial board, Strategic and Military Affairs, and so on and so on. He has such a long list of publications, of books and studies. I was really impressed when I saw in the CV the very, very long list. Member of White Paper Commission on Defense and National Security, member White Paper Commission on Foreign and European Policy, Vauban Prize, member White Paper Commission on Defense and National Security, Brienne Prize, George Hans Prize. So, Mr. TERTRAIS, you have the floor. Vous avez la parole.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. I was about to tell you to stop. It was becoming embarrassing. Thank you very much. It's actually a real pleasure to be back in Bucharest. This is actually where I did my very first professional trip in 1991. I was part of a monitoring mission for Romania's first free and fair elections. And it's always a pleasure to see that this country has become a vibrant democracy, a strong member of the EU, a strong member of NATO, maybe soon a member of the OECD, member of the Schengen area. So how this country has changed and been transformed, it's always a pleasure to see this. So in retrospect, I think there have been two most remarkable evolutions for NATO. One is obviously that it has nearly doubled in size, but I think the most remarkable one is really its endurance and adaptiveness and ability to adapt to circumstances. And not only is NATO the most durable and strongest and biggest military alliance in the contemporary history, but it has also had this ability to go from collective defense to crisis management and now back to collective defense. And this was not a given because it's also a heavy, sometimes cumbersome, sometimes slow organization. But I think its members and its leadership have been able to steer it very effectively in the past decades. Going back to 2002, I think that we were right to give Russia a chance. We had to do it, if only to make sure that nobody could say we did not give Russia a chance. No, we did. We created the NATO-Russia Council. We made the unilateral commitments not to have significant combat forces presence permanently, not to have nuclear weapons in the East, etc. We made sure that Russia had a chance to see that our missile defense plans, the US and NATO ones, were not directed at Russia. So we gave Russia a chance. And again, we should not regret it, because that's the only way we can say now, it's not us, it's you. Russia has changed more than NATO did. And Russia has not changed because of what NATO did. Still, I think it was wrong in retrospect to do three things. First of all, I fully agree with Charles. The Bucharest decision was probably the worst of all possible compromises. In diplomacy they say, compromise is a good thing by nature. Well, no, sometimes compromise is not a good thing. And indeed, Charles, I agree with you, the Bucharest decision was at the time thought as being a reasonable position, but that neither nor was probably the worst of all worlds. Of course, it's easy to say that now, but we have to learn from our collective mistakes. The second mistake we made is that we never really managed to find common language to warn Russia that even though Ukraine, Georgia, and other former countries which used to be in the Soviet bloc, even though they would not be members of the alliance, we would still care about what happens to them. There were ways to say that strongly. Okay, they're not members, they don't have the map, But watch out, because we care about what happens to them. We could have done that. We never really did it. We did not manage to make Russia think twice about what we would do if it attacked Georgia or Ukraine. And Georgia should have been the warning sign. We could still have done it after what happened to Georgia, but we did not. The third mistake, I think, was to keep our unilateral commitments for so long. Remember that in Madrid, we did not say the NATO-Russia funding act is dead. Okay, maybe it's indeed better to put it in limbo and to not say whether it's still valid or not. But I think we could have sent a stronger message to the effect that these unilateral commitments we made regarding the permanent presence of significant numbers of combat forces and the changes of our nuclear policy, these are signals that we could have sent earlier on. It could have helped. Now, none of this may have deterred Russia from invading Ukraine, but at some points I think we were too timid, too shy, and not bold enough. A few words about what has changed regarding my own country, because it has had a particular position in NATO. When we came back in 2009 to the integrated military structure, it was simply a pragmatic decision. Yes, the French can be pragmatic from time to time. So it was a pragmatic decision. NATO had changed, the world had changed, NATO was doing crisis management. It was better we were participating in those operations, so it was better to be fully in than to be partly out. There was also the idea that we needed to build trust with our allies and partners if we wanted to show that we did not consider the EU as a competitor to NATO. So that 2009 decision, and I can speak from experience because I played a small part in the brainstorming that led to that decision, it was also a trust-building exercise. That no, the EU is not. I know that some people, including maybe in this country, still think that the French see the EU as a competitor to NATO. So we've been saying no for 15 years now, maybe almost 20 years, but still, if you don't want to believe it, what can we do about it? So that complementarity between the EU and NATO that we are looking for and that we all agree upon today was also one reason why we rejoined the military structure a bit more than a decade ago. Finally, a couple of points about our policy vis-à-vis Russia, because it is connected with our policy vis-à-vis our host country, foreign minister, as you know well. And I think that many of you in Romania remember that it was the French who suggested in early February, that NATO should have a permanent presence, or at least an increased presence in Romania or in the southeast. And I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, Minister, I think the first French soldiers arrived on the 27th or 28th of February. So our commitment to the defense of the southeast and to the defense of this country cannot be put in doubt. I fully agree with Charles on his diagnosis on the Brussels summit, and overall with the words that have been uttered by previous speakers on the Brussels summit. I think it is a very successful summit. The identification of threats is clear. First, Russia. Second, terrorism. That's something which has not always been noticed by some observers. Second is not China. Second is terrorism. And the unity of the alliance was not a given. I think it was also a good strategic concept which was adopted with an adaptation of strategy, in particular for multi-domain deterrence, which I thought was quite successful. The language on EU-NATO cooperation is also very clear and very satisfying. And on China, I think we collectively managed to avoid a China versus Russia trap. I think on these matters, the declaration and the concept are appropriately fine-tuned. I know that think tankers like to criticize, and that's what we do every day. That's our bread and butter. But sometimes we have to tell our government, hey, you know what? You did things right. You did good this time. And I think that in Madrid, you guys in government, minister, if I may, you largely did good. I think it's very dangerous that we treat China and Russia as a bloc. The more we will do so, the more we will encourage their narrative, which is the West is against us. They are different. They don't form an alliance, even though their cooperation grows and grows. I think their relationship will be increasingly complicated, but we have to make it clear, as we did in the strategic concept, that China is a strategic problem, a strategic challenge, and increasingly so, but it's not a direct military threat to Europe. So finally, what remains to be done for NATO, just a little reminder, the candidacies of Finland and Sweden have been accepted, of course, but they're not, the ratification process is not finished. And the way the small number of allies which still have to ratify will do so will be very, very closely watched by the other allies, and it is to be hoped that this ratification process will be successfully concluded in a smooth way, but let's wait and see. But I want to finish with one particular question that was raised by Charles earlier on, is the problem of the possible scenarios for future US policy. It is true, Minister, that our unity was maybe more powerful than ever. And again, I share this view in terms of the messaging that we gave the world in Madrid. At the same time, we don't know what a US president, a Trump-like or DeSantis-like president would act vis-a-vis NATO. Recall that we now know that Trump was actually getting ready to withdraw from NATO. I know that's a scenario we don't want to think about, but no, I'm putting my French hat back on because the French like to warn their allies about this possibility. Sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're right. When Macron talked about the risk of a brain death in October 2019, he was actually referring to something very specific. He did not say NATO is brain dead. He was referring to the fact that the solidarity among allies between the US, Turkey, and France in Syria was not worthy of what an alliance should be. He was referring to what he thought was a breach of trust between the US, France, and Turkey in Syria. He said, by the way, also, but everybody forgot about it, that the military organization was doing fine. So, even though his words were blunt, maybe too blunt, he was not referring to the death of NATO per se. But remember that it may take only one tweet to break the Atlantic Alliance. I used to have these discussions with my Polish, Baltic, and other friends during the Trump presidency. They were telling me, yes, but look at, as General Mattis used to say, don't listen to what he says, look what we do, our presence, physical presence. Yeah, I know, I understand that. But deterrence, including deterrence of Russia, is based on perceptions. And a US president who decides to significantly alter that perception would severely weaken deterrence of Russia, whatever the number of US troops on the continent. Therefore, and I will leave it at that, yes, the Europeans need to continue to enhance their defense efforts because it's a win-win. It's a win-win proposal. It's good for NATO, it's good for Europe, it's good for the transatlantic relationship, and it also helps us prepare for the hypothetical and very unfortunate scenario in which the next strategic surprise would not come from Moscow but from Washington.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Now we are running out of time, Okay, I had prepared some questions to the speakers, but I will not ask them. I allow you to ask 2 questions, but please let be very short questions in order to allow our speakers to answer. Who would like to ask? Anybody? No? Please, sir.
Political, economical, civilian and military. If decision is taken for military instrument of power to be used, for us it's clear. Our objective would be fight the war.
Can you? Yes.
So our objective would be fight the war and win the war. But, sir, Mr. TERTRAIS, would you possibly see any effective use of the non-lethal instrument of power in order to ensure the Russian compliance? Thank you.
The question is addressed to?
It is addressed to Mr. TERTRAIS.
Can you clarify it? I'm sorry, I did
yeah.
not hear part of your question.
Do you, sir, see any effective use of non-lethal instrument of power in order to achieve the Russian compliance?
Russian compliance with what?
With anything, just in order to solve a crisis. In the given case, in order to have them deterred to start an aggression against a NATO nation.
Please.
Yes, well, thank you for that question. I think most of what we do to prevent further Russian aggression is actually non-kinetic. NATO is not at war with Russia. NATO is increasing its deterrence vis-à-vis Russia. So yes, that's a military non-kinetic, but not only military. I think that one of the key lessons from February the 24th is that the deterrence failed. Our deterrent failed. Not our military deterrent, but our economic deterrent. You see, one of the lessons for me of February the 24th and the 6 months that ensued is that one, our deterrent failed, that is the threat of massive economic sanctions were not enough. 2, our military deterrent continues to succeed because it seems that Mr. Putin continues to treat Article 5 protected countries differently from non-Article 5 protected countries. So I think the key now is to ensure that if faced with the prospect of defeat or at least failure in Ukraine, as is likely to be the case, how do we deter Russia from intervening further in the southern Balkans, in particular in Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, and of course in this country's neighbor, Moldova, which needs to be commended for the amount of efforts it gave to, like Romania, to the Ukrainian refugees, and fortunately we are helping Moldova. So that's the key question, and I will be mostly non-military, but deterring Russia from messing further in the Balkans and in Moldova is I think, one of our next big challenges.
Thank you all. The last question, unfortunately, because we are running completely out of time, we do not have time for further questions and answers.
Thank you very much. And since I'm working with the Satellite Center in Madrid, I can say this was a stellar panel, very comprehensive, very interesting. But the question is the following. And it's addressed to all, what is concerning you most when you look into the future? Is it the economic crisis, the price of energy? Is it the potential lack of resilience of public opinion? Is it elections in some of the NATO countries or EU countries, US or others? And what's to be done about it?
Who would like to answer? Mr. AURESCU, will you start? Bogdan.
I would be very, reserved in saying what is concerning for the future, because I don't want to create waves of concern in the public opinion or to, I don't know, have an impact on the stock market. what is important for us, for instance, in the near future is, on one hand, to continue to support Ukraine. And as far as Romania is concerned, we will do that. There is no place for the so-called fatigue, which is mentioned, well, quite a lot these days, but there is no place for fatigue. As far as Romania is concerned, we will continue to support Ukraine on all dimensions. Second, it is important to continue the pressure on Russia, to isolate Russia, to continue. All these instruments are valid. Sanctions, isolation in international organizations, the path of well, ensuring that impunity is not ensured for the perpetrators of crimes against humanity, war crimes, aggression, and so on. And I think the effort of keeping unity of the transatlantic community, this is also an instrument which needs to be, to continue to be functional. So instead of worrying for the future, I think it's important, of course, to have prospects of possible evolutions, but I think instead of worrying for the future, I think it's the right time to be proactive and not to react just for the sake of being defensive. This is, I think, the most important right now. I'm worried, for instance, if you want to mention, I mentioned one particular point. For instance, I'm worried about the incoming so-called referenda in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And I have mentioned that during the Gimnich meeting in Prague the day before yesterday. I mentioned that we need to be prepared for this scenario and to have a proper reaction to that. But this is one element that I can bring up right now. For the rest, well, we have to continue to work together in unity. I think this is the most important thing.
Could I?
Mr. Benedict.
Thank you. As far as fatigue is concerned, I absolutely agree with the Minister. There's no room for fatigue when it comes to Ukraine. We are fighting through Ukraine also for our way of life, and that's why we should continue supporting. As far as what worries me is energy security. And in this connection, I would like to recall that a couple of decades ago, when the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek was asked by a foreign journalist about the region, he uttered the phrase, you know, we, the Balkans, we are the future. And it turned out that he, in a way, was right when it came to future developments. And in that sense, I would just like to draw attention to the fact that during the past 2 weeks, you have had rolling blackouts in Kosovo. And if that is any harbinger for the future, we really should take care of our resilience also in the energy sector.
Thank you. Mr. Powell.
That's a great question. At an abstract level, of course, we're all worried about the future of democracy, the social cohesion of our Western societies, and so on. But since this is a Black Sea and and Balkans forum, I'm worried that we are losing the Western Balkans. We have done very little to help the candidate countries in the Western Balkans to converge with Europe, politically, economically, socially. President Macron, as you all know, has proposed the creation of a European political community, which might enable us to bring the Western Balkans closer to the EU 27. And I would go further. I think we have to offer these countries access to some elements of the four freedoms. By the way, we're already doing this with Ukraine, freedom of movement. So why are we treating countries that have been negotiating for EU accession for decades in some cases worse than we are treating Ukraine? Obviously the war is the answer. But if we really don't want to lose countries like Serbia, we really have to change our mindset. Thank you.
If the question is, what worries me the most, and I need to answer in one sentence, I would say the corrosion and weakening of our collective ability to resist to strategic shocks coming from outside due to the rise of disinformation, populist forces supported by non-Western Asian powers. That is, the weakening of our ability to sustain inbred and outside encourage forces, and I fear that it will weaken our collective ability to successfully manage and resist strategic shocks.
Thank you. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the debate was so interesting, unfortunately, we have to stop here our discussions because there are other people who will have to come here. Let me thank you to all the speakers, to you for the present, and I invite you to applaud our speakers. Thank you.